Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very special episode of Power Perspectives. My voice probably sounds new to many of you. My name is Kinsey Grant Baker, and I am the head of content at Energy Central. I'm here today with a distinct and exciting purpose to facilitate a conversation with our very own community manager, Matt Chester, about the week we just had. We are fresh off a packed few days at DistributeTECH, a sort of season-defining event for the who's who of electric utility, transmission, and distribution teams. The show was bursting at the seams with innovative ideas, interesting presentations, and important conversations about the future of utilities. And we got to see it all, up close and personal. So today, we're doing something a little different on Power Perspectives. Matt and I are going to have a conversation all about DistributeTECH, what we learned, what we heard, and what we thought about the path utilities are taking toward the next era of energy. Because at the end of the day, one thing is certain. That path is being carved by future-oriented individuals and teams and companies. So today, let's talk about some of the biggest topics they're focused on as we move forward. Matt, you had, I think, 10 expert interviews, 8 expert panels and or learning sessions at DistributeTECH. You must have put in 20,000 steps every day running around the show floor. And you were generous enough to write down some major themes from DTech that dominated your conversation. So I want to go through a handful of them and hear more about what you saw and learned. And we'll jump in a second. But hello, how are you doing?
I think I'm finally physically recovered from it. 20K steps might have been underselling it, but it was, even more so than the physical toll. It was a lot mentally, learning the bright lights, seeing everything going on. It was an exciting event. So there was a lot of fun stuff to take away from it.
There definitely was. I think the highlight for me was obviously meeting a ton of cool people and learning about what they do, but also all of the activations that had sweet treats. Like I'm a huge sweet treat fan, and there were M&Ms everywhere and cookies. I came home with a purse full of sugar, which was super exciting. And I told you this already, but I couldn't stop talking about utilities and T&D to my husband, who's an engineer, but not this kind of engineer. He was like, cool. So what do you want for dinner? It was very interesting to try to come back down to earth after that, because we had a lot of really cool conversations as a team. We had a couple other members of the Energy Central team there as well. And we just couldn't stop talking about some of these big ideas. So we can start with that. I want to jump in to some of these themes that emerged over the course of the week. We've all shared some ideas from our team on what we thought were the big central conversations to DistributeTECH this year. I think personally, the one that I heard the most about that really cropped up in a ton of different conversations I had was this pivot from reactive to proactive for utilities. This shift from the kind of rigid models, centralized models, to more decentralized, self-orchestrating, planning ahead, kind of how we see that shift manifest across the utility industry, I think is something really interesting. And I know you have some thoughts on this as well.
Yeah. It's really a reflection of some of the tech-driven changes, I think, happening to the power sector. And one of the first sessions I sat in on was with Gabriel Valdez at GE Vernova. And he's a former telecom professional, newly into the utilities in the past handful of years, I want to say it was. But he set the tone for me by talking about how, his experience in telecom. It might seem a little bit foreign, but really that telecom industry went through an immense transformation. You think about, in the 90s, early 2000s, what telecom was to what it is now, and how that kind of complete reformation of the industry and what's important, what it's doing, what technology it needs, that happened in front of our eyes. And now you see it in the Zoom calls you have, the iPhones in your pocket. And he set the analogy that that's what the utility is doing right now. And so while a lot of this is very new to us in the power sector, it's not new to industry generally. And I thought that was a really interesting idea and kind of inspiring, as opposed to making these changes feel daunting.
Yeah, absolutely. And not to jump ahead too much in our conversation, but it's a really good segue you set me up for here. But this idea that we also kept talking about as a team, that utilities are becoming technology companies and technology companies are becoming utilities is something that's really interesting. We see it in a ton of examples in our day-to-day headlines, but tell me a little bit more about how you kind of saw that play out at DistributeTECH.
Yeah, it's like I said, technology driven, which is a major theme. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But, I remember when I was first studying energy technologies and the grid, and, smart grid was the hot topic, and you couldn't read anything without it being about smart grid. And that was very technology driven as well. It was, hey, we have these sensors, these monitors, these tools that allow us to do some new things, some really exciting things. We started talking about, is it possible to have two-way power flow, and what does that look like? And as much as that was a smartening up of the grid compared to where it was, it's fair to say we're looking at that smart grid 2.0 right now, and it's moving past the idea of, oh, we have this cool technology, let's put it there, see what it looks like, to instead saying, well, what do we want those technologies to do? What would be cool and useful for, call it a smart 2.0 technology to do on the grid? And that came up time and again is, all right, we've evolved past even the smart grid. It's one thing to say the utilities for 100 years were stagnant, and now we're advancing in tech. We're kind of in this second evolution where, calling things smart is almost, old school at this point.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about it in that way. Something that I have heard time and again in coming to the electric utility industry after, not spending a lot of time here. I came from Smooth. We joined the Energy Central team and started working with you not that long ago. But one of the things I've heard over and over again over the last 9 or so months is this idea that the utility industry, for as new as it is, right, in the relative span of human history of innovation, it is an industry that takes its time to adapt to new technologies. And I think the way that I see the utility space borrowing some of the, for lack of a better, turn of phrase here, the move fast and break things ethos of tech has been really interesting, because if things break, people get hurt. People might have their power turned off, right? Like there are actually life and death consequences. So to be able to mimic the relative speed of the tech industry to bring innovation to bear is something that's more difficult for an industry that's as heavily regulated as the utility space, for an industry that has such high stakes as the utility space. So seeing the kind of convergence of tech and utilities has, I think, really been super interesting. And we mentioned in the beginning here too about the tech companies borrowing from utilities. We talk all the time now about, Microsoft's nuclear deal and Amazon's insert renewable here deal. Like, these big tech companies have big power needs. How they're going to meet them is something that, continue to come up. There's a lot we can unpack here, but, if there's any other tech highlights that you really want to make sure we hit on, I would love to hear it.
Yeah, no, I would just want to agree with what you said about, the convergence of tech and utilities. And this is another point that I think we might touch on later, but the idea that the utilities that we're always seen as full of inertia, slow to move, again, there's good reason. Not only is there the life and death consequences, but to protect those life and death consequences, they have very tight regulations, and they can't necessarily move with that same dexterity. But at the same time, you walk around that DistribuTECH floor, you're not going up to utility companies, you're going up to software companies and hardware companies, and those are the ones who can do the let's innovate, let's try something new and see what happens. And more, it's the utilities going outside of their own house to those tech companies and saying, well, what do you have for us? What can we do? And I think that willingness and ability to not do everything in-house, but bring in those partners is part of what's unlocking all of these new opportunities and the accelerating pace of these changes.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the key themes from a lot of these software companies that you mentioned was definitely artificial intelligence. Can you give us the sort of highlight reel or big themes that emerged with regard to AI?
For the past 2 conferences, it seems like everybody is here to talk about whether it's their AI tool or what AI can do or what it might do. And I think in year 2 of AI being the one of the dominant themes, kind of like I was saying, we're shifting from smart grid to smart grid 2.0. It seems like, we're not an AI 2.0, but we're evolving what that conversation looks like, and not just slapping a chat bot onto something because it's possible and seems cool. One of the interviews I did with Sabi Chandra from TCS, Tata Consultancy Services, he highlighted what he saw as kind of the different integrations of AI into utility work. The first, most basic one was assistance. How can AI be a support tool for workers? That is a little bit more of the chatbot opportunity. How can somebody in the field have a question, ask a chatbot, see what happens there. The second level, as you get a little bit more sophisticated, was augmenting. How do you enhance the decision making from those human workers? So it isn't just helping the human worker, understand or know the next step. It's kind of bridging human brain and AI brain into making the better than the sum of its parts. And then the really forward looking, he highlighted transformation, and that's what'll come. We're seeing dabbles of it now, but it'll really come in the following years. But the examples he pointed to were things like regulatory filings, which are hundreds, if not more, pages of long documents that pull in all sorts of assets from across the utility enterprise, and how that would take bulky teams hours and hours and hours to pull together. You can now use an AI-powered tool to at least get a good start there. He cited 95% accuracy and reducing the human workload in doing so. And obviously you still need the human element to review, make some, final decisions and process. But we're seeing that elevation where, what's the goal of AI? It's to take those rote tasks that humans don't necessarily need to be in and getting them automated so that we can get creative minds and creative people to do the higher level tasks. So that's what's cool to see the shift in the AI conversation going from the people I talk to at DistributeTECH.
And quick plug for the people you talk to at DistributeTECH. Matt, I mentioned you had all of those expert interviews at the beginning of this conversation. They will all be on Energy Central in due time. So be sure to check them out. I want to talk about another big one that we saw emerging as one of these key themes. I would call it the sort of renewed focus on the end customer. It's not necessarily novel to say we want to consider the experience of the customer in how we build and plan and strategize as a utility. But this seemed like something that a lot of people were really talking about, a lot in terms of how they're especially structuring planning as a utility. Tell me a little bit more about what you heard here.
Yeah, and you're right. Obviously the customer has always been central to the utilities. A grid outage is bad. Why? Because of what happens to the customers, and rising prices is bad because it hurts the customers. But time and again, the conversations brought up the idea of we're really focused on customer metrics and customer experience in a new way. And I think part of that is, one, the technology getting so good that you see more reliability, you see more opportunity. So you shift towards focusing on the customer and their experience more than ever. And part of it is, as these new technologies come available, there's new metrics that we didn't really have to look at or think about before. And oftentimes, talk about the regulation of the utility sector. The regulators look at metrics that are intended to boost the customer and make sure the customer is getting what they need and what they want. But it's almost looking like now those metrics of past years are almost rudimentary compared to what matters the most. And the example that I've really opened my eyes to that the most is I was speaking to a panel of Australian utility executives. They were there in cohort with Ed Giro. You'll see them on our Energy Central interviews at DistributeTECH. But one of them, Guy Chalkley, he heads up Endeavour. He was talking about how within Australia, in his jurisdiction, there's the manufacturing plant that makes all of the IV bags for the entire country. So really critical product that's needed for medical purposes all over. And at some point I think it was in the past year, but sometime recently, the customer, the manufacturer came to them and said, we got to talk about all these frequent outages. They're killing us. And Guy said, I don't know what you're talking about. Look at these metrics where, if anything, we're getting praised by the regulator by how few outages we have. We're getting all thumbs up. But as they started to talk, what they came to realize is that the manufacturer had been experiencing seconds long of outages, call them brownouts instead of blackouts, which didn't show up in the traditionally monitored metrics for the regulators because sounds like not a big deal. The power's right back on. We don't need to worry about that. But for this manufacturer with very sensitive manufacturing equipment, what it meant was every time it went out for a second, the machines froze. They needed to be reset. All the partially created IV bags that were on that line had to be tossed. It was a huge cost to them, a huge issue for them, but it didn't traditionally show up in those metrics. So that was his light bulb moment that he was able to share of, all right, well, we still track those regulator-focused metrics because it's regulated, we need to, but those aren't the ones that are on my dashboard anymore. He shared, all of the KPIs I'm looking at are unregulated because they're going to the next level and really focusing on the customer. And that's one very tangible example. But like I said, in at least half of my interviews that I did, a renewed focus on the customer was top of mind. So I think we're going to start hearing more and more stories like that as data evolves and new metrics, come to light that really focus on the customer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember in one of the early sessions I sat in on at DistribuTECH this last week, the conversation about advanced metering. It's one that you can't really have without considering the actual way that people interact with the product. I think there is a lot of concern from the industry around buy-in from end customers. Are people going to get this special meter put on the side of their house, even if it only takes 15 minutes to install? Are they going to use it? Are they going to use it correctly? All of these are, I think, big questions that lend themselves to the even bigger question of just how utility planning is operating today. The thing that we had written down in our prep for this conversation was top-down versus market-driven. This is, I think, a critical element to how that planning comes to be. But I would love to hear a little bit about your perspective on planning in general and what you heard from people on the ground at DistribuTECH.
Yeah, the other interesting term that I heard thrown in a lot was orchestra or orchestration. It's funny because it kind of mirrors a previous physical evolution of the power sector. We went from centralized power plants that sent out the electrons all across the grid wherever they were needed. And over the past 10, 15 years, we still have those power plants, but all across the grid, we have those distributed sources of generation. And so it's not just a central out, but it's kind of a whole orchestra playing together. And, where the electrons were what was being sent out before, now I think what we're seeing is data is kind of that product that's being collected, analyzed, and then sent throughout the grid. It's not just, hey, let's send that data to the central brain of the operation and it'll make decisions and send it out. But you're seeing smart meters make individual decisions on their own. You're seeing edge technology that's taking in its data. And so instead of, again, having one internal system that's analyzing everything, making all these decisions, that AI adjacent brain is in all of these nodes. And it's really interesting to see.
And I think it also lends itself to one of the big conversations too, that's maybe a little less specific to the day-to-day business and a little bit more of what I would say we could classify as an existential question for the utility industry. It's just that the workforce is changing. As we talk about the modern needs of the modern utility and what those look like in the future, pretty much this entire conversation we've had so far has focused on data, AI, automation, understanding how tech interacts with utilities operations. All of that requires a certain skill set. And it's not a skill set that is unlearnable, but just naturally, there is a bit of a shift in the kind of workforce that we expect to succeed in the utility space. Generally, the shift is toward that more tech focus, that future orientation. And it's a people challenge is how you put it. And I think it's a really interesting problem that is going to require a lot of smart people trying to solve it. There's no one software provider. There's no one utility. There's no one energy media company that's going to solve this problem. It's all, again, the orchestration of all of these different elements of this industry and this sector, trying to figure out how we solve this people challenge. But what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, it's very similar to what you mentioned earlier with, hey, you can have this smart meter, but if the customer doesn't want to put it in, the tech doesn't do anything. It's the same on the workforce side. We can make the best technology, but the human elements have to be able and willing to use it. And what I'll say is it really stuck out to me is the past decade, it's almost become a trope of talking about the challenges of the aging utility workforce, especially when we're talking the line worker, the field worker, all these type of workers who have been at the job for decades. They're the best at what they do. And maybe because they've done what they've done so well for so long, there's somewhat of a resistance to new technology of, well, do I really need to play with this funky iPad? I'm just going to do it the way that's always worked for me. And that's been a challenge for utility executives who want that technology in there for good reason. Because it's not just about that one field worker's job. It's how that job interacts with the entire ecosystem. So that's been a challenge that I feel like I've read on the pages of Energy Central. I've had at conversations at DistributeTECH for many years. this conference was the first time I brought that up, kind of, expecting to hear the same, these guys aren't doing it. But instead, I was hearing excitement of, actually the workforce is shifting, and naturally some of those more technology resistant people, they're reaching retirement age, and we're doing our best to minimize the brain drain and extract all of their expertise. But as they roll out of the workforce and we're backfilling them with the younger workforce who frankly grew up with iPads, grew up with technology, it's not even a question of, all right, well, now we need to convince them to use this. Those workers come in and say, all right, well, what's the technology solution to this? They demand it, as opposed to the other side of things where the technology companies were feeling like they had to really hold the hand of the workers. So it's an interesting shift in dynamic where I'm seeing for the first time that optimism that, all right, these technologies are being adopted. This workforce is ready, more ready than it's ever been for really adapting to the technologies. And I think, that's coming at the perfect time, because we're not just talking about maps on iPads anymore. We're talking about those iPads being filled with insanely impressive AI tools that can optimize and make sure that they're doing 10 times the work that somebody was doing on their own a decade ago.
And that is urgent for a lot of reasons, not the least of which being that demand is surging. A lot of the conversation that we've had today has centered around the updates to the workforce, to the tech, to the ops, to every part of running a utility. But I think an interesting takeaway that you shared is essentially a lot of these people are building the plane while they're flying it. And that's just the nature of the business, right? You have to make these upgrades, you have to make these updates, you have to improve reliability and resilience while still keeping the lights on. And that's a challenge. It's definitely a challenge. So I would love to hear, just as we finish up this conversation, what you heard from a lot of these experts you spoke with about this idea of the time is now. Can't wait any longer to make these changes. What was the vibe that you were getting from these experts?
Yeah, absolutely. The people I were talking to were largely these technology companies working with the utilities. And so in emphasizing that, hey, at Energy Central, we're talking to the utility people. What do you want them to know? What's the takeaway? What's the advice? And admittedly, part of it could be self-serving as those technology vendors, but they were really emphasizing the idea that bring in partners, bring in the experts who have done it before. It doesn't have to be me and my technology. It could be any of these, but there's so many technology partners out there who, just like you were saying earlier, they are the ones who have broken things, saw what worked, saw what didn't work. So take advantage of that. And, if there's an inertia because of, again, we're seeing a more dynamic utility sector than ever before, but there's still that echo of slow to move and caution. So they said you can start small. You don't need to say, how are we transforming our entire enterprise today? It could be pick and choose where you want to dip your toes in, see what works. I feel like a common message that's just in any technology or innovation is don't shy away from the mistakes. They're going to happen. If anything, the classic adage of you learn more from mistakes. So carefully and thoughtfully break things, see what happens. It's, like you said, all about getting that start now. And whether you want to use the metaphor of building the plane while you're flying it, or should you plant the tree 20 years ago, you missed your chance, plant it now. The main message is it's time, and it's time to really open your mind and take some chances in the utility sector.
What a way to close out this conversation, Matt. I feel like that was the mic drop that we needed. It really is great to hear your perspectives on all of this. I really value all of the information and insights that you shared with us today, and I'm excited to read all of the wonderful interviews that you're going to be publishing very soon on Energy Central. Again, not so subtle plug, go check them out. But thank you, Matt. It was wonderful to spend the week with you in Dallas at DistribuTECH. It's great to talk about it now. I feel like we have learned so much, and I'm excited for covering all of this in the next couple of weeks, but also for DTech next year. So we'll see you then.
Absolutely. Yep. The learning never stops.
Never does. Okay. Thanks, Matt. I'll see you soon.